Welcome everybody to episode 6 of Error Correcting Eric. As always, we're gonna look into a chapter of David Deutsch, The Beginning of Infinity, and today we are at chapter 6, which is titled The Jump to Universality. Yeah. And as you notice, there's something special about this episode. There's something that we've never done before. Maybe Thomas, you can elaborate.
Absolutely. So what's going on now is that we are actually universally in the same place.
Wow, can you imagine? Yeah, it's our first recording in the same room. Really excited about it. Hello. Yeah, there you have it. Yeah.
So it's a live session, at least for us, physically together. So that's always good.
That's always good.
Yeah.
So let's talk about chapter 6, universality. It's kind of a shorter chapter, but it's an important one, mainly because, and I haven't read chapter 7 yet, but it leads into chapter 7, which is about creativity. Yeah.
Right.
But I haven't read it yet. So it's a short chapter, but it's apparently very important. And there are a couple really interesting stories in there. He talks about the evolution of Egyptian hieroglyphs to the modern alphabet as we know it today. He talks about the evolution of Roman numerals, of older numeric systems, until the numeric system that we have today and that we all know. And there's a little bit of storytelling going on, which is actually something new. He doesn't, sometimes his chapters can be a little dry, a little scientific, but now he has some storytelling. And the first story that he tells is about how people used in the early days hieroglyphs or pictures to represent certain things. You can think about the Egyptian hieroglyphs to represent birds and water and cattle and grass. And he calls that a not universal system. And why not? Because even though you can communicate something, if you have a new concept or you have a new idea, or if you have a new word, you need to invent a new pictogram, a new picture, or you need to start combining them. So that's a non-universal system. Is there something you want to add on that?
I mean, so when you were describing that, the first thing I remember from the chapter was, for example, and we always like to have good examples, and just full disclosure, we're joined here by also a non-human entity.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to show.
There's a dog here.
There's a dog here. Yeah. That's my dog. So when Deutsch speaks, for example, about language and how even language is universal, so it doesn't need to be confined to necessarily numbering systems, right? It can go to language systems, and I think that's what we'll get into later as well, is where you have languages that are pictogram based also versus languages that are, let's say, alphabetically based. You don't have to reinvent a pictogram in the English language, for example, or the French or the Spanish language. You can actually just recombine the letters that there are to create those new words. So you work from a finite set of I don't know what let's call them characters, the letters that they are, and you can just rearrange them, rejumble them, and you can basically get across any meaning, anything that you would like to communicate, you would like to speak about, you could do with those 26 letters in the English language, and as well the Dutch language, the French language, and Spanish, etc. So one of the first things I thought about when you said that is the example that Deutsch gives in the book is for treason. Like against the government, you have treason.
Yeah.
If you would do that pictographically, you could say, oh, you have a tree and then sun, right? That would be tree sun. So that's also a way to kind of, write treason, is if you phonetically approach it through that avenue. But at the end of the day, all those letters really represent together are a way to say a word that are essentially phonetic, let's say, realities within themselves. They just carry a meaning because you've come to understand them in the same way. But that to me was like a prime example of what, let's say, non-universal would be, because you could imagine that you couldn't just infinitely link together these pictograms, right? Because whenever you had a new combo, you would either have to be lucky that your new word was built out of the pictograms phonetically that you already had before, or you would actually have to create a whole new pictogram and a new meaning, etc. And I think that's what we've done for most of our, let's say, Homo sapien lifetime, is we've had symbols and these things to describe things, which was not universal because it didn't lend towards, again, rejumbling the existing to create the new.
Yeah, exactly. And when you come to think about it, when you talk about rejumbling, reshuffling existing things to create something new, that really reminds me of explanatory knowledge, scientific theory, because that's usually also how new knowledge, new theory, new ideas are created. Usually they don't just appear out of nowhere. They're reshuffled, they're reordered, they're reused to create something new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. The numeral example, for example, and the chapter, it does more, right? It speaks about as well how we maybe accidentally, let's say, uncovered these universalities, and Deutsch conjectures that it probably was never the intention that whenever we did come across a universal system, that it wasn't intentionally meant to be universal.
Yeah.
It was actually a parochial problem that was being solved, and it happened to be universal. So, I mean, again, we could be wrong because we can't actually ask those people that had invented the universal systems, but it is likely, likely or not, there's no evidence pointing to the fact that they developed it for the sake of universality. While now you see programming language and all other kind of attempts there are to building further on our knowledge are somewhat more directed towards that universality. But at the time, because it was a very parochial time to be alive, it wasn't that. And it brings me to, for example, like Roman numerals, right? Or for example, like you could, like, until what number did a Roman general need to be able to count, right? That's kind of how I look at things when I think about what is a day-to-day numbering system's limitations or limits. When you go into what would the maximum amount of numbers be that you need. And another thing that and I'll get back to the Romans in a second, but another thing that happened, if you speak about, let's say, a large sets of numbers, it wasn't necessarily that, for example, they thought that the amounts of grains of salt within, let's say you were able to say, okay, how many grains of salt are there on planet Earth, right? That's a legitimate question to ask.
Yeah.
There's an answer to that. Is it unknowable? No, I think it's technologically possible to know, although it may be very difficult to get to the exact grain of salt. But at the ancient days, they would have seen it as literally infinite. They would have seen the salt as literally being infinite, although they wouldn't have a mathematical infinite conception of what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think this is also coming back to the previous chapter where we have abstractions versus, let's say, physical reality and abstractions reality, the duality principles that Deutsch speaks about. So back to the Romans now. So I think when you speak about, like, to what degree does one need a system prior to universal discoveries, I think it was built to the degree that it solved the problem of, let's say, the Roman general that could look at the field and see how many of his soldiers were still alive, and he would then need a system, to kind of count how that was, and that would be like a tally system eventually, right? That's kind of how the Roman numerals are. And I'll end after this, but one of the funny things I remember hearing from Brett Hall was like, he said, like, I don't understand why we still teach Roman numerals in current school systems, because it's just, it doesn't do anything, doesn't serve any purpose. It's like learning the ways of medicine when like they did in the 12th century. Who's teaching for historical purposes? Yes, it's interesting to understand how knowledge grew, but that's not how it's being taught in schools. At least when we went to school, and kind of caveat here, Eric and I went to school together. is that they teach it legitimately as an actual system of counting that one should be able to apply. And remember that we had tests where we had to actually count those things together, which was very difficult because it wasn't a universal system, right? And you had the 0s to 9 system that was universal and did lend itself to more pragmatic ways of counting on top of, let's say, the universal applications even. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a funny insight. I never thought about it that way. Not is it less practical, it's also way more complicated. Because depending on how you arrange two symbols, let's say you want to represent the number 9, you need a y and an x, and then somehow you have to know that you need, if the lower number is in front of the larger number, you have to subtract them. You have to do 10 minus 1, and that magically is a 9. So it's a more complicated system. It's also funny that you mentioned the tallying system, because that was actually, according to David Deutsch, one of the first counting numerical systems. You know, if we go back to early days of mankind, we didn't have to calculate many things. We didn't have to keep track of many things, maybe the amount of sheep that we have. So we had a very simple system tallying, putting some lines. And then later, he talks about incremental change. Because you apply incremental change and incremental improvements on your system, at some point you will reach, as you say, maybe on purpose, maybe on accident, a universal system. And the first iteration on the tally system was, if you want to represent 5, that you have 4 vertical lines and then you have 1 horizontal line. So you can at a glance see, oh, that's 5. And if you have 2 times 5, that's 10, which makes a lot of sense. If you work with low numbers, 5, 10, 20, 30, you can kind of see it at a glance. But once you go over 100, then it starts to become difficult. Yeah? And that's, I think, what you said about like the Roman general, you know, what numbers did they need it were useful and practical in their daily life. And at some points, as civilization grew and became more complex and so on, we had a need of a system that was a little more complex, that could allow for higher numbers, for easier notation. And I think that's also the problem with the Roman numerals. If you go into the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, you start to get really large systems. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of space if you want to write that down. And so once you go into a higher need of numbers, that old system no longer applies.
I mean, yes, but it's also more than that, right? Because you have to, you cannot represent the number in itself. You represent it as a combination of its elements, which is less so in our universal system that we have right now, because 315 is 315, while you would have to, and I'm not even going to go down the path of what that is in Roman numeral formulation, but you would have to basically tally up everything again, because you couldn't say by looking at it that's 315. Right? Why is it not 316? You know, because it's more of a tallying system where you couldn't, and it's easy to go back to the parochial sense because at a glance, but it's more than that. It's more than just the, let's say, the practical application. It goes into, and when you said, for example, it's more complex, like I said, yes, but it's actually, these universal systems simplify things. They simplify the way that it's used, and a very good now example is, you know, I remember when the Americans sent like a rover a satellite to Mars, and it crashed. And the reason why it crashed is because it was using the metric system, the empirical system, the imperial system, not the metric system, which is a lot easier. While the imperial system has miles and inches and feet. So the computer on board actually couldn't process all the information on time with, you know, the vast complexities of outer space and what it was programmed to do. It couldn't do it. So, and again, you can fact check me on this, but I remember the story hearing that it crashed into Mars because of, and this is before we had the rovers and everything, but I remember it crashed into Mars because the computer just basically crashed and it couldn't compute anymore. And the reason of its crashing was that the computational energy, right, if you will, that it takes to compute miles and inches, which are not They are less universal, I'd say, or maybe not even universal. I haven't thought about this specifically, but it didn't lend to efficient, let's say, computation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and while the metric system does lend itself to that, so even on like recent events, right, you could say that inches and miles, they weren't created to be universal. They were created to be actually parochial. Like your foot, right, was a foot, was it 1 feet, 2 feet, right? An inch, I forget where that came from, but knots, right, in sailing as well. You have knots, which were also the amount, and it's like now it's like 1 degree on the Earth's circumference. That's what 1 degree now is and 1 knot is. But historically, it was 1 knot was the speed of which you were sailing against certain. I don't remember exactly, but
I think it was what they used to do. They used to have a rope, and they used to like tie.
They threw it in the water.
Yeah, knots at certain intervals, fixed intervals.
They would clock it.
Yeah, and then they would like at a certain amount of time just count the amount of knots that would slip through their hands.
Exactly.
And then they would know, oh, we're going at 5 knots.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think that's where it came from.
Yeah, but then again, you would still need to define there needs to be a speed component, right? So you have like the amount of knots per time.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be the knot. But that brings me to an interesting point, because actually, and I have a boat license, so I should know this better than what I do.
Yeah.
Luckily, technology gives us the actual speed now. But as it relates to no, I lost it. I lost my train of thought.
You lost your train of thought.
Yeah.
Let's go to another train of thought then. About there's a beautiful story in that chapter about incremental changes, where because we talked about numerals, we talked about alphabets.
Yeah.
Before you lose it again, you want to share it?
Yeah, I'll say it now. So
all right, go.
I gotta get back. So I got back. So as you go into tallying the knots, right? For example, that goes through so again, physically you have to. They're standing on the back of a ship, and they have all these ropes, and the rope is basically subsegmented with knots. So every let's say meter or so, there will be a knot tied in the rope, and then they'll throw the entire rope in. Well, not entirely, but they'll throw the first end into it, and the water will carry the rest of the rope through it, and then there will be 1 knot passing, 2 knots passing, 3 knots passing. So there's a certain fixed amount of time that they with a sand, like a sand meter, that they'll then time it for. So once the sand ends, they take the rope back, and they would have counted the amount of knots that went into the water, and that would represent the knots of speed at which that vessel was going. So imagine you make a mistake on tying the knots, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you would be off. You would exponentially be off the incremental mistakes that you make, because it's an analog system. And this is the tie I wanted to make here between an analog and a digital system, because analog systems cannot be universal because they do not allow for error correction. Because let's say you put the knots at every interval and you tie them slightly off, that error will extrapolate itself. That error will become on larger scales quite substantial. So you can imagine a general that's sailing the ship and wants a decent speed, and I don't know if the impact would be large enough for, in this specific parochial case, to have an impact on the general's ability to do his job or sail to that place, or fight with that other what's it called, naval pirate ships, or platoons, or whatever the word is. But you would miscalculate if you would have 5 knots and you were expecting 6 knots. Right. So let's say on every increment of knots distance, you would have a 10% margin error. You would only have to have 10 knots before that 10% became 100% error, and you would be off a complete knot. So you would go from being driving at 5 knots, or you would think you're at 6, but you were actually at at 5 in this case, for example. So that's an analog system, and it's not universal because it doesn't lend to error correction. So that was my point.
Yeah, I think he describes the difference between like analog and digital, between like a digital system has discrete values at fixed intervals, at fixed numbers. It can be 0 or 1 or 1 and 2 and 3, but it can be nothing in between.
Yeah.
While you have an analog system, it can be any value in between.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you mean if you tie a bunch of knots in a rope. There's no way that you can tie it exactly the same every single time. It can be a little bit off, and then the next one will be a little bit off. I think that's how he describes the difference between digital and analog. And if I remember correctly, he also refers that because indeed those computations are way more difficult on analog system, there's basically no such thing as a good analog computer. That's why our modern computers are digital. And because the computations are based on zeros and one, they're very easy to do. But imagine that you have to do your computations on 0.99999 and 0.0005 instead of just ones and zero, that would become exponentially more difficult to compute anything. So I think that he refers to that in the chapter.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that, but I don't think necessarily that's what the distinction is about, because the system 0.55 that you're referring to is in itself, again, universal. So you're using a universal system to describe a non-universal, a digital system. It lends itself to universality. And again, I'm not sure I'm getting the nomenclature here exactly right, but you cannot apply that to the analog system, because in a digital environment, it's not that it's a 1 and a 0, it's that you can correct the one that was mistakenly set as a 1 back to a 0.
Yeah.
While in an analog system, that thing has passed.
Yeah, exactly.
And you cannot take back the knot.
Yeah.
In the computation that you're performing, which is measuring the speed of the boats, let's say, is the computation, you cannot take that back and start again easily, which you can do in a digital environment, because it has universality, being the 1 and the 0 being the main jump to universality that allows you to actually write programs and codes that will then have certain error correcting mechanisms within it. Because if you would have an analog computer, and I think he describes it in the book, how they used to have it with all these cogs, right, and these big machines, and was it Lovelace and Babbage?
Yes. Yeah.
They would have these big cogs, and in theory, that would be able to compute on the punch cards, and all these things. Like in theory, that's a computer, and it can compute things, but any error would flow through the system. It wouldn't be corrected, and so you would never be able to trust the end result of that computation.
Yeah.
And I think that is more kind of in tune with what the digital error correction brings to the table in terms of universality, is that you can, and I use this word trust now kind of parochially, but that you can, instead of having your knots go through your hands, because there's a lot of errors that can creep in there. First of all, your knots could be mistakenly put. Second of all, the person that is supposed to be grabbing the rope at the right time can be off a beat, can be sleeping or whatever. Then third of all, the sand meter that you're using could be off as well.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of error that is not correctable in this environment. While in a digital environment, the analogy is that you can correct. Oh, sorry, not the analogy, but the benefit is that you can correct for those things intermittently.
Yeah.
Tallying systems, for example, are similar, right? Like, let's say I think he uses this example in the book where you're tallying sheep, and you're tallying these sheep, and as they come in, you're a sheep herder, right? And let's say you tallied all your sheep, you've got 50 sheep counted, but you remember you left with 55. Did you lose 5? Did they die on the way? or maybe it's the other way around. You have more sheep now that you counted than you actually have physically. Like, did they spontaneously generate? You know, like all these kind of things. It's not prone to error correction. While universal systems and digital systems are, because and I think maybe I don't know enough. I forget what it was specifically about in what this contrast was, but the ones and zero application allows for error correction incrementally throughout, where you can actually test the result back to its original, and then you can have this feedback loop that actually allows for a more accurate computational result.
Yeah, I think there's an example in the book of, he imagines a computer with, like, as you described, with like cogs and turning wheels.
Yeah.
And let's say that that's analog.
Yeah.
Yeah, and things have to spin around and then, you know, give an answer. But imagine that there's just one tiny cog that's just a little bit off. Yeah. It's not like perfectly aligned on the number. Let's say the number that's supposed to represent like 5. It's a little bit off, you know. And then the other cogs, they will turn according to the first one that's a little bit off, and they will be off as well. There's no way of telling that. And then he says the only way to make it digital is to not just have completely round cogs or spinning wheels, is to make little notches in them, and that it can only be turned and set in those notches. Yeah, and it cannot be turned into something in between.
Right.
So then you inject an error correcting system, because it will always jump in a notch. And maybe if the system gets, you know, like blocked or something, is really close to a certain notch, you can assume or like push it back into the notch, and then it will continue again.
Right. Yeah, that's the 0 and 1 principle, basically. Yeah. You can only have 2 settings.
Exactly.
And any setting in between is an error.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then if you have some spring-loaded mechanism, you know, you can make it like that there's maybe a little pin that has to go in the notch, and it cannot stop if it's in between the notches. Right. It has to go in. Right. Yeah, and that's the error correcting the 0 and 1 system.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it reminds me of the let's say the outsourcing of computation that is often done through numerical systems. You know, bringing it back to our let's say Roman numeral examples, or I know the Mayans had, you know, or you had these tapestries, right? Also that have counting systems. And I know that from a historical perspective, it's super interesting, right? To go back and see how did these people count. I think sometimes people go a little bit too far in the, you know, the praising of these systems as if it's something better than what we had. You know, these people that out there that look at, oh, these Mayans, and they, you know, there's a comet, and how did they know? And, you know, somehow they think that ancient civilizations had a more direct line to the truth than we had today. You have these sub-segments of society that like to think that, but, you know, I don't, you know, we're going to the moon, we're going to Mars. Sometimes it surprises me how in awe people can look at these very ancient, literally ancient, and not only ancient in the sense of that goes back in time, but also ancient as in, you know, our stuff right now is a lot more advanced compared to what they had, because it wasn't universal and all these things. And that's, I think, what David Deutsch brings into as well. What Britt Hall also has spoken about on his podcast, is saying, guys, we have to like stop fetishing about these ancient cultures that somehow got a couple of things right, you know, and or we've interpreted that in their scripture as being right, rather than there being a good explanation for why they got it right. Yeah. And so going back to the tapestry example, or the Mayan Aztec way of counting, and I don't know the details, but I remember that if you would have to know the rules of the game before you would be able to compute whatever the physical depiction said, right? The substrate said, and that is again, it outsources the computational energy to us, to humans. So same with the Roman numerals. You would have to know that the 1 before the 5, you know, meant that you subtract the 1, right? Yeah. So again, that all has to happen where? That computation is not happening in the 1 and the 5, but it's happening in your brain as you are deciphering the Roman numerals. So a lot of these older, or let's say ancient ways of, or parochial ways of counting that aren't universal, were actually merely just giving the computational we're outsourcing it to the interpreter of the system rather than itself it being a computational system.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. If I can summarize that in the way I understand it, yeah, so you have the system, but then you always still need like an external, external knowledge to be applied on that to be able to do something with it. You need to compute it, you need to subtract, you need to add. And that's also funny because he also mentions in the book where the word computer comes from. It didn't used to be a device; it used to be a job.
Yeah.
So
right.
let's imagine that we're an engineer in the 19th century. We need to build a bridge, and we need to get some calculations done. Well, there's no computers, there's no calculators. So how are we going to do complex computations such as strength and the way the bridge is going to bend and so on? So you would outsource that to a computing company, which was full of engineers and mathematicians and people that did computations by hand. But they did thousands of computations by hand, and it was very prone to error because you have humans doing it. Yeah, and if you have to do a lot of computations and one error sneaks in, it can have an impact on everything else. I also thought that was a very interesting story in that chapter.
Yeah, the original computer was a person.
Yeah, exactly.
And it still is a person today because we are universal computers ourselves. Our brains are universal constructors. Yeah, we are universal constructors. But it's funny that the name computer was originally, as you said, was a person that was going through literally the computation. Because that's all it really is. It's computation, and that's one of the profound insights, and I think overarching philosophical discoveries, but also physical, let's say scientific discoveries that David Deutsch did. He combined what was computational theory and quantum theory. Now it's quantum. What's the exact quantum computing? Sorry. Yeah. He is the founder, basically, of bridging those two things. And I think in the beginning of the book, of the beginning of infinity, he says, new theories that explain more, they bridge the gap between things. They don't make things more divided. Same as Einstein, who bridged the space-time and the speed of light rather than having it separate, like Newtonian physics had. And
interesting.
So, any explanation that does more, universally speaking, always becomes like a sheep herder almost of the other ones, in a sense. Yeah.
That reminds me a bit of an earlier chapter that we talked about, because there we said that I don't remember how exactly, but it was you are either capable of explanatory knowledge or you're not. It's a 1 or a 0. It's black or white.
Yeah.
So I believe that he used that as a definition of a person, an entity that's capable of explanatory knowledge.
Yeah.
And you need, let's say, a certain amount of intelligence or whatever to be able to do that. And if you reach that level, it's the beginning of in infinity. There's nothing that you cannot explain or that you cannot comprehend. And with a universal system, it's kind of the same thing. It's either universal or it's not. And we talked about incremental change, and there's a cool story in the chapter about the printing press.
Yeah.
So what they used to do is that if they wanted to print a book, they would etch an entire page into maybe some metal or wood, I don't know, and then they would print the entire page. So they had to create a printing block for every single page, which was, of course, very labor intensive. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time. It was not a universal system because every single time that, even if you wanted to change a single letter on a page, you have to remake the entire block. And then there was an inventor who came up with individual letters and a framework that you can slide in the letters in a page and then print it as that. And if you want to change something, you can just slide out of the letters, change them, reshuffle them, and print again. So it's a small incremental change, which takes it from a non-universal system to a universal system, because with the interchanging letters, you can make any page, any word, any combination that you can imagine.
Yeah, it's the print. I mean, yeah. Overall, yes. I think just a couple of error corrections are that so what the universal jump that we did as humans going from, let's say, genetic knowledge to explanatory knowledge is a gap that we haven't bridged yet. We don't understand when or why that happened. Maybe when we have somewhat better of an idea of, because we know kind of when persons, right, the universal explainers came to be, because there's evidence of creativity then, because that would be new knowledge created as creativity. But there is a, as you say, there's a qualitative difference between what is a human or a person, as David Deutsch then calls it, or what is, let's say, like a dog, for example, which is not a universal explainer. A dog is very bound by its sheer nature. It may have some ability to mimic, same as parrots, they have some ability to mimic behavior. And that's something that we also do as humans, but more profoundly, we create knowledge. We have no idea why or how that happened. That's still a very open question, which we'll solve one day. But as you said, the principle of mediocrity is often what's invoked here, is like, why would we expect, for example, an alien coming, to this planet? Why would we expect to be able to understand them? Why would they be to us as we are to ants?
Yeah.
But that completely gets the point wrong, because we are universal explainers and we can explain anything that is explainable within the laws of physics that we are a part of. Therefore, we can explain anything. Basically, should we have, let's say, want it, or should we apply the knowledge to want to get there, or sorry, the effort in solving those problems. So, but it's interesting you made that connection. I haven't, I've thought about it that way, but that's the interesting about this book and about talking about these things. You always get these new little insights about, oh yeah, but that also works from that angle.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you were talking about this to me about how, parochially, let's say non-universally, they were developing the printing press, which then were initially these, as you said, these pages were just the pages, and they had to physically stamp every page, and then recreate the book by recreating the iron pages, right, which was a very labor-intensive effort. One guy just had to think of chopping those things up into the incremental letters, and then you could just rearrange the letters, and you only needed those letters, and you can print the entire book.
Yeah.
Rather than having 100 of these iron plates, you needed 26 letters.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But then how do you go from a society, right, a culture that is just running the usual way of doing these plates, and asking the ironsmiths to create the next page? I'm kind of just going off rails here. I don't know if that's how it happened.
Yeah.
To oh wait, guys, what sparked that first guy's idea to say, let's chop it up? And how much resistance did he get? Because meanwhile, you're employing all the all the smiths, who have a lot of jobs going on, and they probably don't like change, like humans don't like change, so they want to go against. So it's very interesting, to think of it that. I mean, it makes sense.
What mechanism or how does it happen that you go, probably they created single page blocks for hundreds of years, and then just one person had to implement that change. But how do you come to that change, especially first in your mind? Because at a certain point you will have an idea, then you have to make it and test it and do it, and then you have to go to the entire change, and people are going to be negative. They're going to say, no, you're crazy, we've been doing it for hundreds of years like this, we're not going to do that. Interchanging letters, you heretic, But
that idea, right? That person that had the first idea.
Yeah, where does that come from?
That's creative. That's creativity.
Yeah.
And we don't know where it comes from.
Yeah.
There's no explanation for that yet.
I believe that they do talk about creativity in the next chapter. Yeah. So maybe we can discuss a couple of minutes on that.
Sure.
About that.
Yeah.
But before we dive into that, those were all the cool stories and all the insights that I got from chapter 6. Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to elaborate or shine some light out that you read in chapter 6?
No, I think the chapter really is just meant to describe that systems, and the first time I read it, it was mind-blowing to me, because I never thought of it that way. I never thought about a system lending itself to something that was universality, because we're so used to just learning, let's say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, until 9. We're so used to applying that. We're so used to having it solve all these problems, that you forget that somebody had to come up with that. And before that, there were Roman numerals, which didn't allow us to, it wasn't the right, let's say, breeding ground to allow for all that additional creativity to be unleashed upon. So similar to our DNA was a universal jump, the RNA and the DNA that we're built out of. In itself is also a jump to universality, where you went from amino acids and all these building blocks of molecular DNA to DNA as a knowledge conveyor, as a knowledge multiplier, if you will, as a knowledge substrate. That was also a jump to universality that, again, we don't know how it happened or why it happened. So I think that was interesting, because we have more of a grasp on that historically, because we have more records, right, about how these non-universal systems became universal, and maybe that gives a little bit of an insight as to, who knows, why amino acids became in DNA after a while, and just conjecturing now.
Yeah. That is true. We didn't talk about DNA, but that was for me also a profound insight, because he explains that I believe there are only like 4 letters, so 4 types of molecules in DNA. Yeah. And if you combine them in certain ways and you reshuffle them, you can create any DNA code. But if you think about it, all life on Earth, plant, fungus, fish, mammalian, any life on Earth that ever was, that is now, and that probably will ever will be, organic life, is built from DNA, and that's made up of 4 building blocks. So with only 4 building blocks, you don't always need a complex system to make something universal. It's, as you said, it's simplifying things. You have 4 building blocks, 4 letters, 4 types of molecules, and by just combining them and reshuffling, you can create any life that we know on this planet. And I thought that was really cool insight.
That is an amazing insight, and it just speaks to, first of all, there's only one life, let's say, origin of life story that we know of on Earth. Maybe there were some before, but they didn't. They're not here anymore, right? Maybe they weren't fit for the environment in which they came to be. They weren't universal enough, potentially, right?
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't know how that went, and we don't know why. Also this let's say, single cellular life that was out there for quite a long time, all of a sudden became complex, became multicellular, and lended to Homo sapiens and dolphins and trees and birds, and we just don't know what happened, that because universality was baked into DNA from the get-go.
Yeah.
Again, we don't know why it became universal. Like, putting that aside, the universality wasn't exploited for millions and millions of years, where there was only amoebas out there and low life viruses and these ancient viruses that still live today, that outdate us, that are way older than we are, that we still know of. And we know of the fact that the Earth for a while was just like microbes and viruses, and wasn't anything like, let's call it, I mean, it was very special that existed, but let's say we're more special than that. It was very, like, whatever the universality was in there was dormant.
Yeah, exactly.
For a very long time. Yeah. And then after, I forget how many millions of years, you'll have to check this on the internet, but let's say all of a sudden something made it do what it was capable of. And obviously it's the environment, right? It's physical reality that impacted the universal and the universal DNA that just wasn't being applied universally yet. It's like having all these numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, but still using it up until 10,000. You know, like the Romans did. It's like having that, but not using it for its full breadth of universal capacity. And that, I find, that is for me, such an interesting question. I mean, apart from all the other fascinating questions out there, I remember thinking, like that's true. Like DNA has been has been around for a long time, but it didn't do what it could do from day one.
Exactly.
It took it a long time. So
there's only one explanation possible. It has to be aliens. There's no other way. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I see that we have a couple of minutes left. This is something that we typically don't do, but let's do it anyway. Yeah, so the next chapter, as I said, is about creativity. I haven't read it yet. Can you shed some light, maybe as a sneak preview in 3 minutes? That's all we got. Some light on creativity. What's the core principle of the chapter?
So you're testing my knowledge now of the specifics of the book, because what I do before we have our chats is I reread or re-listen on my audiobook the chapter before, which I've now done for this chapter, and I've read the book now already 3 times, but still. Yeah. You're testing me on my actual memory here, but let me talk a little bit about just again what I've come to understand what creativity is.
Yeah.
So creativity is the literally the creation of new knowledge, something that wasn't there before that now is there. And a good example is the relativity theory, itself, like the equations and the let's say the explanatory knowledge within the equations that Einstein wrote, those of special relativity and general relativity, did not exist when the Big Bang happened. Right? Any knowledge that we have now wasn't there during the Big Bang. So it was literally created. It wasn't there before. Because if it was there before, then it would have been here already, and nobody had to create it in the first place. So my most profound, like, let's say, philosophical shift that I've made in coming to grips with what creativity isn't a painter, or isn't a musician, although that is also being creative, but is the general act within your own mind of creating a new explanation for something. And let's say, you only learn a case study, let's say, like a hypothetical situation where you put somebody in a classroom and you only teach them everything up until Einsteinian physics, but you don't teach him Einsteinian physics. Let's say by some fluke he comes up with it himself.
Yeah,
that would be a general act of creativity for that brain, for that mind. Sorry, but it's better to build on top of what we as civilizations build, and as a culture we give to each other, because the shoes that we're wearing, the clothes that we're wearing, Homo sapiens were not the first human species to invent clothing. So we also took that from whatever ancestors those were. So we should absolutely build further on the knowledge that we've created to be more creative, right? But there is the creativity in the sense that a mind thinking of a new idea is a creative act. And then there's us as a species, or as a culture, I think is maybe a better way to describe it, as a culture to create new knowledge that just wasn't in the universe before, for example. So that's been my most profound kind of philosophical insights there, to understand what, and I think Deutsch explains it also in terms of like, what do musicians and physicists have in common?
Yeah.
And he says, they have a waste basket of papers next to them that are just been, wrapped up because something was wrong, right? The musician like Beethoven, he's writing something down on his papers, and just it doesn't sound right. It's not what he wants, right? So he takes the papers, he throws it in the bin. So he says physicists and musicians have a lot in common. They both have those paper baskets filled with errors, because and then we get to, I think we're skipping a couple of chapters again, so we'll wrap it up in a second. But another sneak preview is that, for example, what is Beethoven correcting towards, right? If beauty was subjective, or if morality was subjective, like, what is he correcting for? What are we correcting for? And I think that is one of the first moments I was like, of course, like Beethoven, when he threw away something that didn't sound right, why didn't that sound? What was that? Why didn't that sound right? What was he had something in his mind that he was moving towards, but it wasn't, when he wrote it down, it wasn't what he had in his mind. So he was testing it against reality. he was writing it down, and he didn't like it, so he threw it away and he started again.
Yeah.
Physicists and mathematicians are similar. They write down the equations. They had an idea, a creative act. They write it down. There's obviously a translation problem sometimes between but that's the part of putting it onto paper and testing it against reality. But then what happens is the equations don't really fit, or the mathematical or the physical equation doesn't really match. So they have to throw it away and start again. And that to me was also a very, let's say, a luminous new insight that I had, of a new way of looking at creativity, a new way of looking at knowledge as its own thing. Like, those moments where you go, right? That's like, I think, this book was only that for me, was only,
Yeah.
That's interesting. I've never looked at it that way. And that act and that feeling sometimes is the act of knowledge creation, or that's how I've come to understand it. Whenever I go, that's interesting, that makes sense, that's new knowledge being created in my brain. Yes, it's been transmitted by somebody else that had it previous to me. That doesn't take away the creative act that my brain went through to have to make, like, I had to compute it myself, because you didn't mimic it, right? I think that's one of the things that, like, and I'll for sure stop after this, but like Feynman says during one of his lectures, he says, observe. And then people go, but observe what?
Yeah.
And exactly, that's the point. A lot of empiricists think nature is just about observing, but you just have to ask them, observe your way to relativity theory, observe your way until Newtonian theory.
It probably doesn't work like that.
It doesn't. It just doesn't. Yeah.
That's really cool, because I haven't thought about it like that. Typically, when we talk about creativity, we think about the artistic point of creativity, like painters and writers and musicians and people that write theater plays and so on. But you typically don't think about the scientific part, the act of creating new knowledge.
Which is also music. You create a new piece of knowledge through the music.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a cool insight. Thanks for sharing. I'm really looking forward to reading the NAP chapter, to reading more about and learning more about creativity. So I want to thank everyone a lot for tuning in again, and keep up reading the book. And we'll come up with the next episode about creativity very soon.
We will do that. Eric, to sign off, can you do me a favor and put your 2 thumbs up? Hold it. There you go.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks
for watching.
See you.
Bye.
When you got fireworks going on.